The night was eerily quiet when Nurse Margaret stepped into room 303. Her shoes echoed through the sterile hallways, each squeak of rubber against tile sending a shiver down her spine. The usual hum of fluorescent lights was gone. Everything felt muffled, like the hospital itself was holding its breath. Margaret had heard the rumors, of course. Every nurse in the hospital had. The whispers about room 303, about Mrs. Whitmore, about what happened to the last nurse who worked in that room. But Margaret, being practical and grounded, dismissed them as nothing more than superstitions. After all, she was a nurse. She had seen everything from blood-curdling accidents to the most difficult births. The odd feeling that gripped her whenever she passed by room 303 should have been dismissed too, but it lingered like an invisible hand pressing against her chest. Tonight was supposed to be like any other night. Eleanor Whitmore had given birth hours before, and Margaret had been assigned to check on her and the baby. It wasn't a particularly exciting task. Newborns, as any nurse knew, rarely required much attention at first. A quick check on vitals, a quick look at the mother's condition, and then it was on to the next room. But there was something different about room 303, something that made Margaret's hands tremble as she grasped the doorknob. As she pushed the door open, she noticed how dark the room was, despite the flickering overhead lights. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, her golden hair cascading in perfect waves over her shoulders. Her eyes were wide, and although she smiled at Margaret, the expression didn't seem quite right. It was almost too wide, too eager, like someone forcing a smile to cover something far darker underneath. "Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret began, her voice quieter than usual, "I came to check on the baby." Her words felt like they were being swallowed by the silence that hung thick in the air. Eleanor's smile widened even further, and she nodded, tilting her head slightly, her eyes locked onto Margaret with an unnerving intensity. "Of course," she said softly, her voice sweet as honey. "He's beautiful, isn't he?" Margaret nodded, though she felt her stomach tighten. There was something wrong, something she couldn't quite place. She stepped closer to the bed, her heart beating faster with each step. Eleanor cradled the bundle in her arms so tightly it almost seemed like she was holding it too closely, like she was afraid of losing it. Margaret bent over the bed, expecting to see the usual sight of a newborn swaddled in blankets, soft and fragile, innocent. But instead, her eyes locked onto a creature, a grotesque, dark shape, wrapped in a too-perfect bundle of cloth. The thing in Eleanor's arms was not a baby. It was a monstrous insect, the size of a toddler, its black body gleaming under the hospital lights. Its legs, spiny and covered in sharp ridges, curled unnaturally over Eleanor's chest. The creature's large, bulbous eyes stared back at Margaret, unblinking, and Margaret felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. She staggered backward, her breath catching in her throat. The thing was a cockroach the size of a child. Its segmented body moved slowly, its spindly legs twitching. The antennae, twitching like antennae do, seemed to sense the air around Margaret, and for a moment, the room felt thick with the presence of something unnatural. The sound it made, a soft clicking, was faint but unmistakable, like a rhythm, like a lullaby. "Wah, what is that?" Margaret stammered, her voice shaky, barely a whisper. Her heart hammered in her chest as she tried to understand what she was seeing. Eleanor didn't blink. She simply tilted her head to the side, and then, in a voice so sweet it made Margaret's stomach churn, she answered, "What's the matter?" "He looks just like his daddy." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on Margaret's chest. She felt a deep, primal instinct to flee, to escape the room before she went mad with the horror of what she was seeing. Her hands shook violently, her knees buckling under her, but she couldn't take her eyes off the creature. The sound of the clicking grew louder, almost as if the creature was trying to communicate. Eleanor hummed softly, rocking the bundle in her arms as though it were a regular child. The air was thick with tension, and Margaret could feel her pulse in her ears, her throat closing. Something deep inside her screamed to run, to escape, but her legs wouldn't move. The creature began to move, wriggling, as though sensing her fear. It was no longer a passive, lifeless bundle. It was alive, alive in a way that wasn't human. Margaret opened her mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The sound seemed trapped in her throat, her voice stolen by the dark presence in the room. Eleanor's smile never wavered. Her wide eyes gleamed with something unnatural, something ancient, as though she knew a secret that no one else could understand. The room seemed to press in on her as the creature in her arms continued to click its mandibles, its eyes locked onto Margaret's with an unsettling sense of recognition. Margaret turned, her body moving instinctively toward the door. But her legs were too weak. Her vision blurred as the clicking filled her ears, and her breath became shallow, shallow with terror. She reached for the doorknob, but as her hand grasped it, her body seized. She felt cold tendrils of dread creeping over her, suffocating her. Behind her, Eleanor's voice drifted like a melody, smooth and unbothered by Margaret's horror. "It's just like his daddy," Eleanor repeated, humming softly as though the creature was a child in her arms, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Margaret tried to scream again, but the sound caught in her throat. The last thing she saw before her vision blackened was the creature's black, bulbous eyes staring back at her, as if it was trying to claim her, trying to drag her into the same fate that had befallen Nurse Margaret. The clicking of its mandibles was the last thing Margaret heard before everything went silent. The next morning, the hospital staff searched for Margaret. Her car was found abandoned in the parking lot, her apartment untouched. It was as if she had simply disappeared. No one spoke of it, but everyone felt the absence. Eleanor Whitmore and her baby, whatever it truly was, had vanished as well. Room 303 was found in disarray, with strange brown stains smeared across the walls and the bed torn apart. The only thing left behind was an exoskeleton, cracked and abandoned in the center of the bed, a haunting reminder of what had happened. The town began to notice other strange occurrences after that night. At first, it was the small pets, disappearing without a trace. Then, children. Parents swore they heard strange noises at night, clicking, skittering, faint scratching coming from under the floorboards or within the walls. But no one was brave enough to look too closely. Whispers spread like wildfire, rumors of Eleanor Whitmore and her child, her son, who was no longer a child but something far worse. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor was seen late at night, wandering the empty streets of Hawthorne. Her hair, golden and wild, trailed behind her, and in her arms, she still cradled the bundle, the thing that once was a baby. Behind her, something larger moved in the shadows, its antennae twitching. The town whispered. Parents warned their children not to go outside at night, not to answer the door if they heard clicking, and never, under any circumstances, to look at the baby. The last person who saw Eleanor swore he would never forget the sight. She had turned toward him, her smile wide and vacant, as if it had never been meant for anyone else. And for a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw the creature behind her, the cockroach thing, its dark eyes gleaming as it clicked its mandibles in rhythm with her lullaby. And the last words he heard before he turned and fled were those same haunting words Eleanor had spoken before. "He looks just like his daddy." This would be just the beginning of the expanded story, drawing the reader into the eerie world of Hawthorne, slowly building the tension. Would you like me to continue in this manner, expanding the horror as we progress toward the full story? Let me know if you want more chapters or a different direction.